Hello, and welcome to Folklore and Superstition, the show where we tell ghost stories, folk tales, legends, and monster myths from around the world. I'm your host, Cassie, also the co-host of Mythillogical podcast, and today, as part of our tour of the British Isles, I'd like to share a story that I briefly touched on in the Wild Hunt episode of Mythillogical, the story of the Cornish lawyer Jan Tregeagle. There have been a few different variations of the story over the years, some with minor contradictions, while some fill in gaps left by other versions. So today I've compiled a single main narrative from the different versions of this story, and I'm going to follow that up with mentioning where contradictory versions exist afterwards. Jan Tregeagle has been described by the Cornwall Heritage Trust as the Great Ghost of Cornwall, by the Cornwall Guide as the most evil man the duchy has ever known, and by the early 20th century Cornish author J. Henry Harris as the Cornish Faust. A 17th century lawyer, magistrate, and steward to a local baron, Baron Roberts, Tregeagle was always finding ways to use his position and influence to amass wealth, without care for the harm that he did in the process. As the steward to Baron Roberts, he embezzled his lord's funds and robbed the tenants of his lord's farms to line his own pockets. Seeing in his greed and ambition an easy target, the devil, under the alias of Old Artful, made an appearance before Tregeagle, offering him his own lands and all the wealth he desired at the expense of his tenants. Uncaring for the consequences to his soul, Tregeagle signed the deal and was granted a splendid home, servants, and tenants whose money funded his every want. However, in his old age, Tregeagle began to fear the day that the devil took his due, and begged the church for help, giving all his wealth to the church and to the poor in an attempt to buy back favour with God. The priests, bound to forgive any who repented and saved their souls, carried out exorcisms and prayers for Tregeagle's soul to keep the devil from taking him. When Tregeagle died, he was buried at St. Breock's Church at Wadebridge. Despite his sins and his deal, his soul was believed to be at rest. However, following Tregeagle's death, Baron Roberts found an error in the accounting for his estate. He found one farm in which the accounts missed a rent payment and sued the farmer. The farmer swore in court that he had paid Tregeagle the rent and called that Tregeagle himself would bear witness if he did so. To everyone's horror, in the witness stand, the ghost of Jan Tregeagle materialised. The judge maintained his composure and questioned Tregeagle as he would any other witness, where he swore, under oath, that the farmer had indeed paid the rent and he had simply failed to mark the account book. The farmer was released, however the soul of Jan Tregeagle was now in danger again. Unable to return to his rest, and with the devil now able to claim his soul, Tregeagle begged the prior of Bodmin for aid. The priest decided that the only way to keep him from the devil was to bind him to a task that he could not complete until Judgment Day, because the devil could not take him until he ceased his work. The priests bound Tregeagle's ghost to Doesmarie Pool, a supposedly bottomless lake in Bodmin, and tasked him with bailing out all the water in the pool using a limpet shell with a hole in. For many years, Tregeagle ceaselessly worked his task, until one day a storm hit Doesmarie Pool, forcing him to pause in his work. Seizing his chance, the devil set his hellhounds on Jan, who leapt clean across the lake as he fled, slowing the hellhounds who could not cross water. But the hellhounds soon gained on him, and Tregeagle reached sanctuary with the hounds right on his tail. As he reached the chapel on Roche Rock, he did not have time to try the door, instead attempting to leap through the east window. However, Jan Tregeagle was a broad-shouldered man, and only his head could get through the window and inside the church. though the hounds could not take him, they could still bite and claw at his exposed body, causing Tregeagle to scream loud enough to terrify all the surrounding villagers. The priest summoned the Prior of Bodmin again for help. The Prior of Bodmin once again bound Tregeagle's soul to protect it from the demons, and delivered him to Gwenver Cove on the north coast of Cornwall, setting him another impossible task. This task was to spin a rope from sand and deliver the finished rope to Carn Olver, knowing that each tide would wash away any progress. However, this task did not account for the cold winter, where one night Tregeagle was able to pour water from the nearby river onto the sand, freezing it so as to protect his rope from the tide and complete his task. This again left him vulnerable to the devil. This time, aid came in the form of St. Petroc, the patron saint of Cornwall, Bodmin Moor, and the nearby town of Padstow, and also about 1100 years deceased. St. Petroc bound Tregeagle with chains and led him to the south coast of Cornwall, near the town of Helston. Here, St. Petroc set him to carry all the sand from Bireppa Beach across the estuary of the River Corba, until only rock remained at Bireppa Beach, knowing the task was futile, as, like with the sand ropes, each tide would wash the sand back again. However, the demons this time interfered, tripping up Tregeagle as he crossed the river. The sand poured from the sack he was carrying, damming up the river and forming what is now called the Low Bar. St. Petroc once again rescued him before the hellhounds could take him, setting him a final task, to sweep the sand from Porthcurno Cave at Land's End into Mill Bay. They say that Jan Tregeagle is still working hard at this task to this day, and on winter nights you can hear him howling in despair at his fate. Here I have combined elements from the versions told by J. Henry Harris in The Deal with the Devil, The Ballad of the Haunted Moor, which tells of Tregeagle's flight across Doesbury Pool to Roche, and versions by the Cornwall Guide and the Cornwall Heritage Trust, who manage local historical sites and work with communities in preserving Cornwall's history and culture. Harris's version provided more detail on the deal with the devil alluded to by the more recent sources, but diverges from versions gathered by the Guide and the Heritage Trust from local sources in Tregeagle's ultimate fate. In Harris's version, while Tregeagle does attempt to repent for his sins, the devil ensures he gets his payment. Here, the devil, or Old Artful, is said to have given Tregeagle a palace of up-to-date splendour with menservants and maidservants. Rather than waiting for Tregeagle to die of age, illness or accident, Old Artful set a time on his contract to collect, and on the day of payment, he, quote, let the fairy palace, with all its beautiful gardens and stables and greenhouses, sink into the earth, and covered them with water so deep that some said no plummet could find the bottom, which is quite possibly alluding to the origin of Doesbury Pool, which would make this version older than other versions. Trapped in this new lake, Old Artful had Tregeagle work off his debt by emptying the lake with a thimble-sized limpet shell with a hole in the bottom. Tregeagle stopped up the hole with his finger and believed that, while a long and arduous task, it could be completed. Whenever he rested, Old Artful set his imps to spur him on, causing him to shriek with pain so all the locals could hear him, which led to the phrase, to roar like Tregeagle, for a complaint about a well-deserved punishment. Harris ends by saying that there is hope for Tregeagle, as by the beginning of the 20th century, there was supposedly much less water in the lake as before. However, in a later chapter, Harris does also describe the chapel at Roche and the story of Tregeagle fleeing the hellhounds across Doesbury Pool and attempting entry through the window to find sanctuary, quoting the poem in full, which ends with the saint protecting Tregeagle while the pack of hounds wait for him to be vulnerable again, howling on the moors. This is the most common element in every version of the story, that of either Tregeagle, his pursuers, or both, screaming and howling terribly in the night, keeping locals awake and afraid. This is possibly how the connection to the Wild Hunt was made, if somewhere a version of the story was misunderstood. Descriptions of Tregeagle running before a howling pack of hounds, while originally intended to describe him as their quarry, could have been misinterpreted to mean that he ran before them as their leader. One final version, published in 1873 in William Bottrell's Traditions and Hearthside Stories of West Cornwall, gives the most detail on the life of the real Jan Tregeagle. Here, he is described as a most unscrupulous lawyer, rose from low estate by taking bribes to lose his poorer clients' cases, bearing or procuring false witnesses, forging documents to the bequest of property, and other nefarious transactions which resulted in his acquisition of much riches. He is alleged to have married multiple rich heiresses and subsequently murdered these wives for their inheritance. Here, the deal with the devil is not the reason for his tasks. Instead, this version had a moneylender sue his debtor, who denied ever receiving it. The only known witness to the transaction was Tregeagle, which the defendant denied, claiming he wished Tregeagle may come and declare it if it were true. Tregeagle's ghost materialized, telling the court, "I can no more be a false witness. Thou hast had the money and found it easy to bring me from the grave, but thou wilt not find it so easy to put me away." He followed the defendant about the court, and the judge refused to find a way to help exorcise the spirit. The man repaid the money and sought the aid of priests to rid him of the ghost. Unable to send Tregeagle back to the afterlife, the priests instead bound him and set him the task to bail out Dosemary Pool. Here he succeeded, before also succeeding at the rope building task using frozen water. The third time, the priests set him the same sand rope task, but with the condition that he may not go near fresh water, and this task he is still attempting to this day. So ends the various tales of Jan Tregeagle, somewhere on the coast of Cornwall, screaming in frustration on windy nights as he attempts one of his Sisyphean tasks. Thank you for listening to this episode of Folklore and Superstition. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do give us a like, a follow, a comment, a share, all of the algorithmy things. Also go and check out Mythillogical, particularly the episode on the Wild Hunt, where we do mention Jan Tregeagle. Next time, we will be continuing our tour of the British Isles, so I'll see you then.